So, Twilight Breaking Dawn Part 1, which is fourth book and the first of two instalments, which it seems now, in the wake of the Harry Potter success, is going to be the way that you do this. You know, when you look, you get into the last book. I mean, last books are often big anyway, but it's like, hey, from the movie company's point of view, it makes perfect sense. Split them into two. You get two movies out of it rather than one. So, at the end of the last movie, Eclipse, that was directed by David Slade, who I like very much, effectively, the triangle between Bella, Edward, and Jacob had to some extent been resolved. And
just remind us about this triangle.
I was about to say, and incidentally, if you think I'm going to do an up-to-speed plot synopsis with Twilight, forget it.
Who is Bella?
I have two clips for you. One is very, very short. One is a little bit longer. This is the short clip from just after the marriage has happened. Oh, not just after, but relatively soon after the marriage has happened. I mean, a couple of weeks.
What is it?
How many days has it been since the wedding?
14, what? Can you tell me what's going on?
I'm late.
Which you knew from the trailer, okay? They get married. Next thing is, Bella is pregnant. Bella is carrying Edward's...
No.
Well, no, but the point is...
Carrying what? His shopping?
Well, no, the whole point is who knows what. That's why I said Edward's ... Because the point is nobody knows what, because up until now, everyone has believed that it is not possible for a vampire and a human to have a child.
Really?
Things progress.
I didn't know that.
Meanwhile, vampires and werewolves prepare to square off against each other, throwing Jacob...
Have they ever tried to have
Hang
children?
on, let me do this, because this is complicated. Throwing Jacob's loyalties into disarray. Here's a second, longer clip from later in the film.
Sam's lost the element of surprise, and he doesn't want to take you on outnumbered. So he's not going to come at you head on. He's got the place surrounded, and he'll wait for his opportunity.
We won't get through without a fight.
No fights. We won't be the ones to break the treaty.
The treaty is void, at least in Sam's mind.
Not in ours.
Carlisle, no one's hunted for weeks.
We'll make do.
You've done us a great service, Jacob. Thank you.
So many things to say. The first one is that if you haven't seen the other Twilight movies, this isn't going to make much sense, and you really need to see the other Twilight movies. I was at the screening on Wednesday night, the premiere screening, whatever it was, and there were people there.
Not a screening. That was the world
There was
premiere.
the premiere. No, it wasn't the world premiere. The premiere had been in America already.
Okay.
It was
the premiere then.
In fact, I bumped into Anthony Lane, who's a very, very fantastic film critic, who basically said to
I
me...
only know one fantastic film critic.
And James King isn't here at the moment.
No. He's here.
And he said, yes, I'm not up to speed with this yet. There was a couple of people there. In fact, I bumped into Ken Loach's producer, who was there, and who said, I haven't seen the other films. And
Wouldn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, it wouldn't make any
Go and
sense.
have some chips.
Wouldn't make any sense at all. So firstly, if you're not up to speed, in the same way as explaining Star Wars backstory, I'm not going to... I've done as much as I can.
I thought you did very well.
Thank you very much. The other thing which one cannot but acknowledge is that the critical response has been vicious. I mean, even attempting to stay away from reviews, I know that there are at least 2 one-star reviews out there. People have been openly derisory, and and the film has had a real kicking from the critics. The interesting thing with that is there are 2 ways of approaching it. One way is to say, look, there's that fantastic line from Rocky Horror. There's a brilliant line from Rocky Horror when Frank has built Rocky, okay, and Rocky is there, and he's the muscle man in the gold pants, and he's standing there, and Frank wants everybody to say Frank Enferter wants everybody to say how fabulous he is, and he brings him over to Brad and Janet. He says, Brad, Janet, what do you think of him? And Janet, played by Susan Sarandon, says, well, I don't like a man with too many muscles. And then there's this pause, and then Tim Curry says, I didn't make him for you. And in many ways, the Twilight Saga is the living embodiment of that thing. I think it's quite nice, actually, that comes back to Rocky Horror, because it is that thing about, when critics rip it apart, as they have done, it's like they didn't make it for you. But that doesn't mean that's a get-out-of-jail-free card. The film still has to work as a film. The other thing is, I do think that, in general, movies that are embraced by fanboys get a softer ride than movies that are embraced by fangirls. I think, for example, Star Wars has in the past been forgiven for much greater crimes against logic and consistency and actual just straightforward narrative thrust than the Twilight movies have. It has become much more acceptable to be incredibly sniffy about the Twilight movies than it is to be sniffy about the Star Wars films. I think in the case of Breaking Dawn Part 1, the derision is completely uncalled for and is also generally happening with people who genuinely do not get the film. Now, that's not to say there aren't people who understand the Twilight Saga and do get it who won't like it. That's perfectly fine. But I do think a great weight of that critical derision has been from people who simply don't understand why it is that the film has found such a home with that fan base. I also think in general it is very easy for people to be sniffy about fan bases, and I think fan culture is derided in general, particularly teen girl fan culture. My own feeling about it is this was always going to be the most difficult part of the story to do as far as the book is concerned. I mean, it was always going to be the bit which was going to present the most challenges, because essentially it's the bit in which the story steps over into outright bonkers territory. There are so many strange things going on in it. And in fact, if you were in a horror movie, if, for example, you were in It's Alive or I Don't Want to Be Born or any of it's almost as if the most sensible thing to have done with this movie would be to get David Cronenberg in, because in the whole thing about Bella's pregnancy, there is a clear, in my mind, echo of Gina Davis and The Fly, and the original ending of The Fly, which was meant to be the birth of the butterfly child. I mean, this is Cronenbergian body horror on one level. It would even have made sense if somebody had told you that story and said that's a David Lynch story. It sort of would have made sense. So getting in Bill Condon to do it, his previous work was Dreamgirls, and who is somebody who is, I think, to some extent, a safe pair of hands with this material. It's almost as if he's not out there enough. And when all the challenges of the narrative are put up on screen, you either have to go one of two ways, which is either you play them right down or you play them completely over the top. Actually, what Bill Condon has attempted to do is to find a third way. He's done the Tony Blair option, which is to try to walk a path between those two things. There are times, I must confess, when he gets it wrong. I mean, the wobbly werewolves problem is really, really not solved. The werewolves are CGI, and there is often a difficulty with getting CGI anything, particularly CGI animals, to look like they have weight and heft, to look like they're really there in the world. I thought what David Slade did, because David Slade obviously had done 30 Days of Night, he was somebody who had a horror background on him, he'd made Hard Candy, and I still think that Eclipse is the best of the Twilight movies. I think this is not as good as Eclipse, but it's better than the second part, which actually I thought that's the one in which Bella mopes in a chair for a year. Forever. And in which there isn't enough Edward, because Edward is only sort of, for so much of it, is only there in her visions. So I thought that what happened was that Bill Condon attempted to take that idea and to make it as straight as possible whilst not shying away from all the complexities and weirdnesses and twistednesses of the story. And in fact, in other hands, as I said, if Cronenberg or Lynch had somebody would have done it, you would say, well, of course that's a Cronenbergian. So look how twisted it is. Look how twisted the whole logic of it with the vampires and the werewolves and the baby that may or may not be, and the where does this... all those things are coming together in it. The wobbly werewolves issue is a simple technical horror director's thing, and I just think David Slade dealt with it better than some of the other directors have. You also don't have here the sort of the grunginess of Catherine Hardwicke's original one, which was a real charm of the first Twilight film. And there are many occasions in which you think, actually, what I need now is less hairdressing, less makeup, and more sort of earthiness. But that said... and there is a sequence in which there is a long discussion between the werewolves in which they are in werewolf form, but you hear their voices talking, and it just doesn't work. I mean, they should literally have looked at that scene and gone, no, actually, let's go back and reshoot that, and let's do them as...
It's a bit Aslan, is it?
Yeah, but in Aslan, actually, his mouth moves. But in this, they're sort of they're doing it as, and for various it just doesn't work, and it is sort of slightly off. And there was a couple of unintentional there were a couple of laughs in the screening, even the screening that I saw, when, for example, the name Renesmee is first used as a
this is the name of the...
Well, let's not... I don't want to plot spoil, but there is a point in which somebody is talking about one name being Rennie...
Well, you've mentioned a pregnancy.
Yes, but the whole point about the movie is what is going to happen. Is Bella going to survive? Is the pregnancy going to happen? What? That's the... I mean, I know everyone's read the story. I'm just trying really hard to not do the Darth... Darth Vader, he ends up putting a bucket on his head and going over to the dark side. Renesmee. Fine. Boom. On the plus...
What? Is that a name?
Yes, it's a name, and when it's first said out loud, it got a laugh.
Why?
Whereas because it's a silly name, whereas when you read it on the page, it isn't silly.
Okay.
With all that said, The thing that I cried 3 separate times in the movie.
Never did.
Of course I
You
did.
cried
Of course I did.
thrice.
Yeah, thrice. And you should know I was sitting next to your wife, and I think
She didn't report any of that.
Well, I did because if you've invested anything in this narrative, and you know where this narrative is going anyway, despite the things that are difficult and wrong with the film, despite the false steps that it makes, and there are some, it is still telling a story that is involving and is interesting, which keeps being reduced all too often to a simple, morality, which I think is underestimates just how complex the story is. I mean, certainly all the mythology of this is every bit as complex and deep and as open to interpretation as the mythology of Star Wars. And yet, what happens with Twilight? We go, oh well, it's this is just abstinence porn, isn't it? This is basically just it's an abstinence story, and she's a Mormon, so therefore it must all be very simple. It isn't simple. Actually, it's far from it. It's very twisted, very strange, very bizarre, very bonkers, and in several occasions, because when you're putting that stuff on the screen, there is you get to the point you think actually that is almost laughable, and yet there are other moments in it in which it becomes so close to being full-blooded a horror movie, a transitional movie, a movie about body transformation, a movie about all those things, that actually you're quite impressed that Bill Condon has gone as far as he has. In terms of the BBFC report, it's interesting because they say it's a 12A, and of course it's pretty much on the edge of 12A15. They say something very interesting. They talk about a scene later on, which I'm not going to do because that will give away a plot. But here's what they say. They're talking about the consummation scene with the sex scene between Edward and Bella, and it says the fantastical context, the relative lack of detail, and the fact that the scene marks the culmination of a relationship that has been developing over the previous 3 films means it's permissible at 12A. It was very interesting that BBFC actually said the fact that it's the culmination of a relationship that's been developing over the previous 3 films actually was taken into account when they were judging whether or not the movie was suitable for 12-year-olds. I think it's a very mature, very grown-up, very sensible, and actually oddly intuitive response on their part to have actually written it down, to have said, we did take this into account. We are aware that there is nothing in this sequence that is in any way inappropriate or titillatory in the wrong way, because we understand that what it is the culmination of a relationship that's been developing over 3 movies.
Is titillatory a word?
Of course it is.
Is it?
Yeah, of course it is.
I've never heard it used or seen it written down.
So, people sneer and snipe at it because they don't understand it. Other people who have embraced the series may find that there are problems with the film that don't work for them. Other people who have embraced the series may go with it and find that they can get round those problems, as I did. There are things in it that are really good fun, and it romps along. I'm now really looking forward to the last part. I think the derision heaped on it is really, really suspect. I think that I can see... personally, I would have wanted it to have been, as I said, I know this is an absurd thing to say, but I would have wanted a Cronenberg helming it. But in the absence of that, I thought it was a pretty solid take on a very, very bizarre text. I mean, it is a text that you can read it umpteen different ways, some of them good, some of them not so good, that raises so many confusing ideas, and yet somehow underneath it all is this gothic romantic story which has been pushed to its very, very limits within the confines of its, it's going to be a 12 certificate version of this particular story. I'm going to see it again. I mean, I like it. I don't think it's as good as Eclipse. I still think Eclipse is the best film. I think it's better than the second part. I kind of miss the roughness of the original Catherine Hardwicke. But it's the next instalment in the Twilight, which there's so much going on, and there are things to admire and embrace, even when things are wrong with it.
Well, that was the show. I thought it was pretty good, actually, and we dealt with Twilight in the way in which it deserved to be.
Yeah, absolutely. We didn't... Yeah, no, I will stand by that series. I know that there are people saying, oh, he's just being contrary. No, I'm not. And you know this because you've been with me through all these films. In fact, I first heard about Twilight through you. You know that I'm not being contrary. That is what I think about it. And can I just say to all the Twitter writers, oh, Kermode is just being difficult. Oh, yes. Oh, it makes me so annoyed. He thinks those movies... He says that about Star Wars, and then he says that about, you know what? Go home.